Iran's Kharg Island matters because it sits inside a much larger confrontation that no longer looks like a simple exchange of strikes. Reuters describes a war that began on February 28, when the United States and Israel launched attacks on Iran, followed by Iranian retaliation against Israel and U.S. bases in the Gulf. Now Kharg has emerged as one of the most sensitive pressure points in that conflict. The United States says it hit military targets there in the early hours of April 7, while deliberately avoiding the island's critical oil infrastructure. That detail is essential because it suggests Washington is trying to send a military message without triggering the biggest possible shock to energy flows. At the same time, the White House is also signaling that force is only one side of the strategy. Trump says he is willing to suspend bombing for 2 weeks if Iran fully reopens the Strait of Hormuz. But Reuters also reports that Iran is not simply asking for a short pause. Tehran is said to want an immediate end to U.S. strikes, guarantees that attacks will not resume, and compensation for damage, all as part of talks on a more durable peace. So this is the real backdrop. A militarily active crisis is now colliding with a fragile diplomatic opening, and Kharg sits right at the center of that collision. The most important development came in the early hours of April 7, when the United States struck military targets on Iran's Kharg Island again. Reuters reports that some of those sites had already been hit before, which matters because it suggests this was not a symbolic gesture or a one-off raid. It was a deliberate continuation of pressure. But the strike also came with a limit. U.S. officials told Reuters the operation avoided the island's critical oil infrastructure. That single detail changes how the entire move should be read. Washington was not simply choosing a target, it was drawing a line inside the attack itself, hitting military assets while trying not to trigger the full economic shock that would come from crippling Kharg's oil roll. At the same time, Vice President J.D. Vance said publicly that the strikes did not represent a change in strategy. In other words, the White House wanted the pressure to rise, but in a controlled way. The message was that military action would continue, yet not every option had been unleashed. That is where Kharg becomes more than just an island in this story. It becomes a test of calibrated coercion. Reuters says the Trump administration was still waiting for a formal Iranian response by a deadline tied to 2 demands: that Iran renounce nuclear weapons and fully reopen the Strait of Hormuz. So, the strike on Kharg was not separated from diplomacy. It was part of the same sequence. First, keep military pressure active. Second, preserve enough restraint to leave room for negotiation. Third, hold back the most damaging target set, at least for now, as leverage for whatever comes next. That also explains why the strike feels both serious and incomplete. It hit a strategically sensitive location, but not the most economically devastating one. It signaled resolve, but also caution. And because Reuters separately reports that Trump was also willing to suspend bombing for 2 weeks under specific conditions, the operation on Kharg now looks like the sharpest edge of a broader bargaining strategy rather than the start of an unrestricted escalation. What pushed the story further was not only the strike itself, but the gap between what Washington said it was offering and what Tehran appeared willing to accept. Reuters reports that Trump framed the next move as a 2-week suspension of bombing, tied to Iran fully reopening the Strait of Hormuz. The White House presented that as a workable diplomatic opening, and Trump said he had received a 10-point Iranian proposal that could serve as a basis for further talks. But Reuters also reports that a senior Iranian official described a very different threshold. Tehran was said to reject a temporary ceasefire as enough on its own. Instead, it wanted an immediate stop to U.S. attacks, guarantees that such strikes would not resume, and compensation for damage. That difference matters because it means the two sides may both be talking about diplomacy, while still defining the end state in very different ways. That is why the pressure around Kharg cannot be read in isolation. The military strike and the diplomatic messaging are moving at the same time, but not necessarily at the same speed. Reuters also says Pakistan was trying to mediate, asking for a 2-week ceasefire and more time for talks. That gave Washington a political channel to pause without looking like it had stepped back under pressure. But the wider environment stayed unstable. Another Reuters report said missile strikes continued even after the ceasefire announcement, and skepticism remained about whether any pause would hold. So, even as diplomats tried to define a framework, the battlefield kept generating new risks. In practical terms, That means every new strike, every delayed response, and every signal around Hormuz could either support talks or destroy them. This is where the second layer of the crisis becomes visible. The United States appears to be using limited force to sharpen negotiations, while Iran appears to be using tougher conditions to avoid being pushed into a narrow, short-term deal. Neither side, based on Reuters, is acting as if the military phase is truly over. So the conflict is no longer just about whether bombs fall on Kharg. It is about whether controlled escalation can still produce leverage before it produces a wider collapse. The deeper logic of this crisis is that both sides appear to be trying to improve their negotiating position without fully closing the door to talks. From the U.S. side, Reuters shows a pattern of pressure that is forceful but still measured. Washington struck military targets on Kharg Island, yet avoided the island's critical oil infrastructure, and publicly said this did not represent a broader change in strategy. That suggests the goal was not maximum destruction. The goal was to raise the cost for Iran while preserving a line short of the most severe economic shock. In simple terms, Kharg was used as pressure, but not yet as a trigger for the worst-case scenario. At the same time, the White House linked a possible pause in bombing to the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, which means military action and maritime access are now part of the same bargaining framework. From Iran's side, Reuters indicates a different calculation. Tehran did not appear ready to treat a short pause as enough. Instead, it reportedly wanted a more durable package that included an immediate halt to attacks, guarantees against renewed strikes, and compensation. That matters because it shows Iran may be trying to prevent a situation where it absorbs military pressure first and negotiates from a weaker position later. So the clash over Kharg is not just about one island or one round of strikes. It reflects a larger struggle over who sets the terms of de-escalation. One side is using limited military force to shape diplomacy. The other is trying to widen the diplomatic terms before accepting the pause. Strategically, this makes the crisis unusually dangerous. The strikes are limited, but the stakes are not. Reuters makes clear that Hormuz remains central to the dispute, and that is why even a controlled attack near Kharg carries wider military and economic meaning. The conflict is being managed, but only narrowly. And when a crisis is managed that tightly, even small failures in timing, signaling, or response can push it in a very different direction. The next variable is not whether the crisis is serious. That is already clear. The real variable is whether this narrow pause can survive the logic that produced the strikes in the first place. Reuters reports that the 2-week suspension of bombing is tied to Iran fully reopening the Strait of Hormuz, while Iran has attached broader conditions to any lasting peace. That means the pause sits on top of unresolved demands, not settled ones. If either side treats the coming days as a test of leverage instead of a step toward a stable deal, the window could close very fast. A second variable is whether events on the ground move faster than diplomacy. Reuters has already reported that missile strikes continued even after the ceasefire announcement, and that skepticism remained over whether the arrangement would hold. In a crisis like this, even one new strike on a sensitive target, one disputed movement around Hormuz, or one political statement that hardens positions could undo the entire pause. That is what makes Kharg so important to watch. It is not only a target, it is a signal point. If attacks there continue, or if pressure expands beyond carefully selected military sites, it would suggest the bargaining space is shrinking. If military activity slows and maritime access improves, then the pause may begin to look like more than a tactical delay. Until then, the most dangerous fact is that both escalation and de-escalation remain plausible at the same time. What Reuters shows in the end is a crisis balanced on a very narrow edge. The United States is still applying military pressure, as seen in the strikes on military targets on Kharg Island, but it is also signaling that diplomacy is still possible through a proposed 2-week suspension of bombing. Iran, however, appears to want more than a temporary pause, pushing instead for terms that would shape a longer and more durable settlement. That is why this story matters. Kharg is not just a battlefield target. It is the point where force, signaling, and negotiation now meet. And as long as those three tracks remain unresolved at the same time, the danger will not come only from what is hit next, but from how quickly this fragile balance can break.